Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our informational workshop. We will get started in just a moment. I know folks are getting connected, so in just one moment we'll get started, but do thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I know we have a large group for today, so that is great. And before we do get started, I'll just let everyone know that we are recording this informational workshop. So just want to make sure everyone is aware of that. And then it will be available in the future should you want to go back and hear any one particular section of the information that gets covered. And I'll go ahead and go over a few things, and then I will turn it over to our very distinguished presenter today. So thank you again, everyone. My name is Rosie McCool. I'm the Deputy Director at the Chief Probation Officers of California Foundation, and want to welcome you to our presentation today on the California Sex Offender Management Board's recent guidelines for treating and supervising youth who have committed a sexual offense. So this is new information that came out probably about a month or so ago, I feel like, around that time. And so do want to thank Dr. Bolds for making time this afternoon to provide an overview of those guidelines and what CASOMB's role is. And so we'll have 90 minutes to gain all of her expertise and be able to ask questions. And speaking of questions, if you do have a question, please do feel free to utilize the chat to put questions in, or certainly you can use the raise your hand function if you would like to ask a question. And feel free to, we can take those as they come when there's natural pauses in the presentation, and then certainly hope to have time at the very end also for Q&A. A couple of other things: we will be sending out the PowerPoint after the conclusion of this workshop, so you'll get that later this afternoon. And in the meantime, shortly we will drop the guidelines, a link to the PDF document in the chat for those of you who may not have had time to review that. We'll make sure we put that in the chat so you can be scrolling through that during the presentation as well, if there's a particular section that you want to be able to review. With that, I think I have covered everything, and so do want to welcome Dr. Heather Bolds, who is also the Director of the Division of Juvenile Justice, so likely very familiar to many of you on here, but she also sits on the California Sex Offender Management Board. So Dr. Bolds, thank you as always for your time this afternoon. You're a great partner, and so really appreciate you being able to walk us through the guidelines and take questions. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and happy to be here. Happy to be able to go over this with you all and to answer any questions that you have. So really, how I'm going to structure the day of this presentation is to really go through more of each of the sections of the document, as well as explain the background of why it was developed the way that it was, highlight some specific focuses and important information, and then of course, to address any of the questions. I'm going to reference some of the pages as we're going out to some of the details versus getting into every single one of them. But again, happy to answer questions as we're moving through. So to start off, what I wanted to, before we get into the guidelines itself, I did want to speak to a bit in terms of CASOMB's authority. So California Sex Offender Management Board, CASOMB, they've been in, for those of you that don't know, they've been a board that's been in existence for a long time and have played a very important role in managing and discussing issues around 290 registrants, treatment for the adult offenders. So a really important body. But in statute, I wanted to clarify that CASOMB's authority really revolves around those 290 registration. So for juveniles, that has always been limited to those youth who have come to DJJ. Those were the only youth in the state that had those 290s. So for the adults, they do have the ability, because of that authority over the 290s, to be able to do a certification of adult programs. And some of you may be familiar with that. So there's certain certifications that you need to meet as a provider. There's certain things that our agencies must do in order to provide treatment for adult offenders under that containment model. So that's specific to adults. Legislation in 2021 extended the board membership to include 2 juvenile members. In 2019, CASOMB had done a juvenile recommendation paper in wanting to have juvenile, kind of their authority expanded to over those juvenile programs, in recognition that it's an important group as well. Even if they're not registering, the treatment around that group is incredibly important, to be able to have discussions, have a little bit more authority over that, has been a part of CASOMB's discussion since 2019. It was in 2021 where there was a statute put in that expanded the board to include 2 juvenile specific members. That one was a juvenile provider from the community, and the second was the director of Office of Youth and Community Restoration, or a designee for that. So those 2 members are on board. They're currently a part of the discussion, but that did not give CASOMB authority over anyone who does not have a 290 registrant. So they still don't have the authority over juveniles. That's going to be important as I talk about what this means for the guidelines. CASOMB is recommending, and still has put forth in their last 2 annual reports, that they would like to have that authority. So it is something that's going to be a continued conversation. But since that authority is not there, these guidelines were really developed to help provide guidance to probation and providers and courts on evidence-based programs for juveniles with sexually abusive behavior. So it's not a mandate. It's not like it is with the adult providers for on the containment end, that to provide any treatment to juveniles, you have to go through a certification process. That is not the requirement. And so these really are just the guidelines, and being able to say, from an evidence-based perspective, if you're having a youth who is going into treatment, whether individually or through a program on any different level, here are the best practices that we know are in play for when treating this population. I could actually pause there and see if there's any specific questions around that authority piece, because I know that has come up as questions before.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I haven't seen any yet, and certainly if that were to change, that would obviously change the dynamics of the conversation that we're having today. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that for now, but appreciate you walking through that and how CASOMB is different for adults and juveniles, and the specifics around clarifying the guidelines. So and then we did get one question from Tracy. Understanding was that youth returning to SYTF will not have to register, but if you're speaking to youth who are coming from DJJ, that is a little bit different. And so Heather, I'll let you.
Correct, yes. So for youth that are returning from DJJ, there was also a legislative change. I believe it was also in 2021, that previously the language it was for registration was youth discharging from DJJ. The change that occurred in 2021 was to include those that were transitioning from DJJ. So if you have a youth transitioning from DJJ to one of the STYF, I'm sorry, I've got to get those letters right in my head.
SYTF.
They will continue to have to register. If you have a youth now going through your court processes who are being placed in that program directly, they will not have to register.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm just gonna, like I said, walk through the various parts of the document. You will have it to be able to reference, but the first part is the executive summary. And why I want to highlight the executive summary is this: it kind of lays the groundwork for everything that the rest of the document is going to do. It speaks to the background information about this population, the collaborative model versus containment model. So I'm going to get into some of these specifics in just a few slides. So just highlighting this right now. The standards and for the basis for specialized training around supervision. And it then goes into CASOMB's recommendation regarding the authority and some things regarding SRATSO. So SRATSO, for those that don't know, and many of you may, they're the entity that is recommending the sex offender risk assessments that are mandated in the state of California. So there was a change. DJJ's closure impacted SRATSO and the mandates for juvenile risk assessments. So I will also speak to that. But the executive summary is really laying out these changes, again, the importance of why this group is different from adults and what we need to think of. And again, those recommendations that ultimately CASOMB's board is recommending that they be granted similar authority to the adults in order to certify programs. So again, given the goal of CASOMB, this document was intended to be consistent with the document developed for certification. So I wanted to specify that particularly because as you review the document, you'll see like agency certification and kind of those requirements. I'll stress again, these are guidelines and not mandates. So no juvenile program is required to certify any providers, but should that move forward, we wanted it to be consistent with how it's laid out in the adult certification process as well. And so again, should that change, then those agency requirements would become a part of the certification process. We've also discussed as a board that should that change, then this document would of course be reviewed depending upon when that was to make sure it was the most up to date in terms of what requirements would need to be in place for those programs.
Heather, we got a question, and certainly if that were to change, I mean, that would trigger a mandate, certainly. So that carries with it other things that need to be taken into consideration. But we did get another question. Is it likely that the secure track population will be included in the CASOMB authority? And so, but I think that goes back to your comment about that CASOMB right now does not have any authority of youth ordered into an SYTF, but should those things change?
Should those things change, then I think that's where obviously there's going to be a lot further conversation both at the board level and about what those requirements would look like. You know, on the adult end, there's a difference between agency and community providers. So there's a lot of the certification processes related to those community providers that are primarily working with DAPO in terms of the containment model. And so I know that there's been different conversations about what would be something that probation would have to do if they have a program in their facility versus what a community provider will need to do. And so those will need to be further discussed and flushed out if this were to move forward in terms of authority. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so wanted to just take a moment and touch briefly on why recognizing the difference of this population with adults is so key and critical. And I'm just glancing over in truth, and for those of them who maybe have been a part of other discussions, we could probably take at least 90 minutes just focused on these dynamics. But you know, one of the reasons that CASOMB even started having these discussions in 2019 is we've come a long way in the field in being able to recognize the difference between adults and juveniles, which is great. We're much further along than definitely when I started working with this population, you know, over a decade ago. But it's what we know with the juveniles and why it's so important to keep highlighting this and to be able to do these guidelines is we know not only is it important to recognize the differences, but we also know that some of the adult treatment, some of the modalities that are used with adults are not only do they not work, but they can be harmful and actually increase risk. And we also know that with juveniles, over-treatment can also increase risk. And so the board really felt, and rightly so, that there needed to be some guidance around and really highlighting why it's not only important, but it's critical for reducing recidivism and public safety to make sure that this group is, the approach to treatment fits with what we know. So wanted to highlight one of the things that's highlighted in the document is sexual recidivism estimates are as low as 2.75%. So sexual recidivism for youth who have committed sexual offenses is incredibly low. It's a really important concept when we're thinking about how do you treat a population. A lot of the traditional models and a lot of the adult models have a lot of focus on the offense itself. Is it important to take responsibility for that? Absolutely. Are there conversations that we need to have with youth around the offense? Absolutely. But an over focus on that misses a lot of other things we need to do with youth in terms of building skills that in the long run is what will reduce that recidivism further. The motivations behind those offenses. So even though the recidivism rates are so low, we also know that treatment is incredibly effective with this population for various reasons. And I think a lot of this also goes to what we know with adolescent brain development, that what we know for our other juvenile populations and how that brain is developing and how they're continuing to grow and learn and change is still fits with this population. And including in some of the sexual behaviors. And when we're targeting those conversations around what led to that sexual offense, we also know in research that a lot of the motivation behind it is curiosity based. It's, maybe reacting to a trauma that was there, opportunity, not as fixed deviant sexual fantasies and or sexual deviance as you may have with an older adult. So there's fluidity there. There's a lot of room to grow and improve. The other thing we know about this population is the general recidivism rate. So for other crimes is around 50%, I think 53. So what does that tell us? That tells us, okay, so the sexual offenses are at a lower recidivism rate, but general recidivism, obviously, higher, it's right there. But so if we focus so much on the sexual offense, then we're again missing a larger part of what's going to make sure this youth develops into a healthy human being and doesn't recidivate with anybody on any level. And so that really was an important key to take a look at. Well, then how do we structure the treatment to deal with both? And then and it highlights that what works with other youth in our facilities and in our treatment programs are just as important for those youth. So what do we know about adolescents? Skill building is huge. Having them think through and developing problem solving skills. How do you build healthy relationships? How do you regulate your emotions? How do you manage difficult emotions? All of that is incredibly important for this population as well. So it shouldn't take a back seat to focusing on just the offense. Let's see, not sure, happy to pause again and answer any questions around the population. Going.
There's a question from the group. I think we don't have anything in the chat, so. And please do feel free to raise your hand if you have questions and you prefer to ask that way. And when there's another pause, we can make sure to take your questions.
So you'll see this a lot in the document. I've already spoken to it briefly earlier, is the collaborative model. So in 2019, when the CASOMB first started looking at, what would be juvenile recommendations that the board feels are important to make, it was a recognition that to step away from the term containment model for this population, I think, I think the containment model is an important model. For CASOMB, what they wanted to recognize for the groups is even the word containment itself we're trying to step back from that because of those recidivism rates that we know, once a sex offender, always a sex offender. This is something that you always have to keep your mind on. It has to be contained. And so really stepping back and using a different term than for what should it be? It's a collaborative model. And the reason that it's a collaborative model is recognition that for youth, the more services, wraparounds you can put around them, those resources, that community, the better they do, not only with sexual recidivism, but general recidivism. And so it's really intended to create an optimal relationship between the youth and their family, probation, and treatment providers. So really wanting to highlight, it's not one entity that really should be working on this treatment. It's all the important and key stakeholders of who this youth interacts with, and to have everybody kind of involved on this plan is key to this success. So that's why it relies on the open and consistent communication between probation officers and treatment team providers. Involves all stakeholders and key individuals in the juvenile's life, so recognizing the family, along with the youth, recognizing the youth plays an important role in thinking through and in developing treatment plans. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The one thing that I really appreciate about CASOMB as a board in general is it includes a lot of different voices. So we do have probation as a part of the CASOMB. We've got court partners, we have providers, we have individuals representing victims, individuals from the DA's office and local law enforcement. And so what it really does is also create an ability to have some robust discussions around how do you take something that is important and think about it through a working process of what we know operationally is going on. So one of the things that you'll see in the document is we wanted to make sure when we're talking about this collaboration that it was within the context of how it works already for probation, and recognizes we already have a lot of these treatment teams together and there's certain language that's utilized. And so we wanted to be consistent with that, but really highlight again, the continuous communication for this group as you're treatment planning and looking through the progress. So there's really 3 key components to the collaborative model. It's risk assessment, that you have supervision decisions guided by evidence-based standards, and specialized caseloads and training. And so I'm going to go over all of those. So let's talk about risk level assessment. With the closure of DJJ, there is no longer a mandated requirement to do risk assessments for juveniles through SRATSO. Previously, the mandated requirement that was connected through SRATSO are for youth who were sentenced to DJJ, so would have that 290 requirement. They needed to have a JSORAC completed. And so on our end, what we would often do is make sure if we were accepting anyone from to DJJ with who had a sexual offense, that we would make sure that SRATSO score was completed and a part of their intake packet. Even though that mandate is no longer there, the board and SRATSO really want to stress it doesn't mean that assessment is not important to do, nor is it not helpful to do. And so really highlighting risk assessment is still continuing to be really important and key to the program placement decisions and treatment planning. And for youth, a comprehensive assessment is recommended. The comprehensive assessment piece is again recognizing that we have adolescents who are continuing to grow and change with a wide variety of things that we want to be able to target, recognizing that general recidivism, recognizing mental health needs, recognizing education needs. And so if we're looking at putting a treatment plan together to deal with this specific offense, we really have to understand the youth as a whole person. And so that's why you'll see in this document over and over again, it'll say comprehensive assessment is recommended. I did want to take just a moment and talk about risk assessments, because I know that's a question that comes up. In the document itself, there's a couple sections where it may highlight some options, but not as much as the specifics is stressing that the risk assessment needs to be done. So this is just some examples of risk assessments that are out there, several of which probably many of you recognize already through the the SRATSO requirements. The eraser is one that is utilized for adolescents. It's got dynamic and static factors. The JSORAT is just static, which means, you know, it's things you can't change. When you're looking at risk assessments, particularly for youth, those dynamic risks and also strengths are an important part of that, you know, thinking through and looking at how do you target certain things in treatment. So the LS-CMI, the YS-CMI will have some of those as well. The SAVORY, that's one that can be utilized for violence. And again, these are just some of the ones that can be utilized. I will highlight, and we'll talk more specifically about this group later, but we do have a gap in risk assessment for this population. And the gap is regarding our emerging adult population. So the JSORAT, for example, you can use up to a certain age. The static you can use when the person is over the age of 18, but only if they have committed but can't be used if they committed their offense under the age of 16. Still even really want to make sure the offense is more adult-like if you're using it for someone who committed their offense at 16. So we often have as with DJJ, we had this, and now that these youth are coming to the secured programming locally, where you have a youth who may have committed their sexual offense at the age of 15, you're looking at assessing them at the age of 19, and they fall in a gap of there's really not a good risk assessment for them specific to this sex offending risk. That's not to say that you can't look at other risk assessments that look at general, but it is a gap with risk assessments. So I wish I could give you a magic one that works. I do know there's a couple of the MEGA is one that kind of bridges that gap a bit as well too. So there's a few that you can look at, but it is a gap, unfortunately. So one of the sections goes through kind of speaking through supervision decisions. So you'll see again, based on a comprehensive assessment. And this is just made by the collaborative team, that it's really that team working together. And that when you're thinking through supervision decisions, that methods are appropriate and consistent with public safety and accountability of youth. I should step back and say too, one of the things that CASOMB wanted to recognize with this document as well, you know, although the closure of DJJ brought up a lot of conversations around treatment in the community, the other reality is we at DJJ got a very small percentage of youth that had committed sexual offenses. There were already a large population already being treated in the community. And so that was important to acknowledge in this document too. There's really a continuum that we're looking at with youth. And so even with the realignment of DJJ, that these supervision decisions, you know, really should be guided by that comprehensive assessment. What level of treatment do these youth need? Goes back to something I had said earlier. We know if we overtreat, we could actually make somebody worse. It could be harmful. So that comprehensive assessment is really, again, to, is this a youth who could be successfully, and a lot of youth can be successfully treated in the community, maybe an individual provider. We'll go through some of those, again, requirements later. Is this a youth that, based on their risk and the whole picture, maybe does need a more structured program? So that should, again, the assessment should drive those conversations with the collaborative team. So that was really highlighted here. Specialized caseload and training. This was really kind of talking about when feasible, and I want to stress when feasible, because I know a lot of times things that we can talk about are much more difficult to operationalize. But when it's feasible, we're recommending specialized caseloads. So maybe you identify a team that would be the ones who would be supervising youth who have sexual offenses. The reasoning is it allows for the specialized training. I'll even take a step back and say, this group, it's a hard subject, right? You've got some people that it may be a difficult assignment to have to supervise someone with this type of offense, the conversations you need to have, the things that you need to monitor. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. But when it's feasible to create kind of these specialized caseload that again allows for specialized training, so you can really kind of create that expertise with that team, including brain development, including how that impacts this population. What does it mean? Really understanding what the collaborative model is. What are those effective communications for this, working on treatment with all of the providers and caregivers. And again, the challenges of working with this population. So not a requirement, not a mandate, but talked about, if feasible, this is why the board is saying it would be good. There's a section that talks about out-of-home placements. And again, this is looking at going back to recognizing there's a continuum of care for these youth. It could be the youth that are now going to this, the SYTF. I'm going to get these letters. The SYTF, which is, requires the more secure to, maybe even being able to do some treatment locally, whether it's in a group home or maybe even from the youth's home, depending upon the situation and where the victim is. And this section, again, is just really highlighting, let's go back to the recidivism rates. They're incredibly low for this population. So that comprehensive assessment, we really want to make sure we want to provide the youth, maximize what we provide them and what they need, which gives us the best benefit for public safety. And then there's a section that talked about juvenile court transfer and things to think about if there's a recommendation to transfer this youth from juvenile court to adult court. This section, there was lots of conversation with the work group around this. And I will say that probably this was added really as a part of recognizing there's lots of questions for the group that used to come to DJJ and what that might mean for them in the community. I think the goal of DJJ's closure and realignment is not to increase the number of youth that are going to adult prison. And so CASOMB wanted to be able to provide, again, some guidance to and reminding courts and partners with this whole document, but this particular paragraph around, treatment works. And really, if you're looking at having someone go to adult court, there's some really specific things that you should be looking for in that piece.
Heather, would now be a good time to go to, we've got a few questions in the chat.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we have one commenting on, there looked like there was an emphasis on cognitive assessments for treatment planning. And the question is if you have recommendations for cognitive assessment tools.
Maybe what I could do is look and get the best list to maybe I can send that out to the group. There's a wide variety. And we'll get into some of the more the even further on in the document, there's specific recommendations. Sometimes it's hard to give one specific one because there's a wide variety, and it sometimes is best for the provider who's doing it, what they're trained in, and also the youth situation.
Yeah, yeah, if there, even if there's just a list, and we'd be happy to share that out to all the attendees, that would be great.
Yep.
Another question, will Sarazzo resume the JSERAT 2 training program, which is currently suspended?
So from my understanding, I haven't heard yes or no on that end. I could specifically ask CASOMB next time we meet. I know, I think it was suspended as they're also Sarazzo's working through any recommendations that they're going to make for any legislative changes to kind of bring this population back under Sarazzo as well. If there's an interest, I think that's also important to let Sarazzo know, so they know that even with this not there, there's still folks that want to be trained.
Oh, okay, great. So we'll figure out a way to capture that interest.
Yeah.
And when is the next meeting?
The next CASOMB board meeting is next month.
Okay, perfect. And then the last question that we have for right now, before we move on to the next section, the low recidivism rates, is that across the board regardless if the victim is or is not in the home?
Yes.
Okay.
So those come from a wide variety, like a meta-analysis of different types of research that has been done with different populations. So yes. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything more I need to add. You know, so, what I will say is that's kind of the number that's being looked at just as a whole population. And then when you start divvying up treated versus non-treated, treated even gets lower than that, which, you know, is amazing. And then from the in-home and out-of-home, I will say that there are other factors that really will drive somebody's risk to reoffend up higher than just whether it's in-home or out-of-home. It's really the factors around the motivations behind that offense. If there is, there's some things that have remained true for a long time, like, a stranger type of offense versus someone that they know. It's actually the stranger one that is more concerning than the someone that they know. Not to take away from the impact of what that offense is, but from a risk perspective, that deviant sexual fantasy, which is very rare for this population, but obviously on those rare occasions that it's there, that's something that would increase that person's risk to reoffend.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And those are all the questions for now. So
okay. So there is a section that talks about the use of polygraph. And this was actually also included in that 2019 document that CASOMB did as well. And here again is highlighting one of the differences that is something that's used often through the containment model, but for juveniles is really not the norm. Should it be the norm? And actually should be used on a really rare cases. Current research around the polygraph in juveniles is that it's not effective. There's concerns with the validity of it for juveniles particularly. The research really says it should be limited. So anyone under the age of 16, you shouldn't use it at all. So really limited to just that 16 and 17-year-old group when we're talking about minors. But again, rarely used and only justified on a case-by-case basis. So pages 7 and 8 of the guidelines really detail what should be considered when using the polygraph. But as a whole, I will say CASOMB's board really highlights this should rarely be used for juveniles. I'm just going to go over this one really quickly, but there's a number of pages in the guidelines that really kind of just speak to more important treatment components, and this is important for all treatment. So and this is also where you'll see it being very similar to if you've seen the adult certification guidelines, that making it clear there's always informed consent, waivers of confidentiality, releases of information, and a treatment contract. These are just standards that should be involved in all treatment programs. We really did want to make sure it was also acknowledged for this document that when we're thinking particularly of those under the age of 18, we have to remember the parents need to be involved, or the caregivers, the guardians, whoever is connected to that youth. And if we're doing, you know, a lot of times the treatment contract is going through, what is your role? You know, what's my role as a provider? What's your role as the client? And that we need to think about that for the family too. We'll get to kind of one of the recommendations around family therapy as something that can be evaluated and done. So just again, acknowledging that for minors, the parents play a role in. Not a surprise to any of you, I'm sure. But again, one of the differences that we wanted to make sure to highlight from the adult. So there is, get to a page, it gives, I know we already talked about assessment, but this is also where page 11, we really get into what are we recommending when we're saying comprehensive. So it does talk about a comprehensive psychological assessment. So I think this also goes to the list of things that can be utilized. So you have, you know, part of batteries that can be used through psychological assessments, those that you're contracting with to do those psychological assessments, you know, will be able to really, given the case, identify the assessments that make the most sense. Again, recognizing that you want to get a complete picture of the youth. So although we tend to, with this population, particularly focus on risk to recidivate, and what does that mean for that person, and let's plug them into something, you know, based on that skill. In truth, it really should always be more than just one assessment. You really should be looking at a whole picture. But for the youth, particularly because to individualize treatment, to target the things we need to target to make sure we're focused on what will help this person become a healthy individual and not reoffend in any sense of the word, is to understand what are their full needs, what are their developmental needs, are there education needs that we need to pay close attention to. Then that could be IEP types of, you know, information you get from school information as well. Maybe you're combining different assessments. Mental health needs are important. Trauma is a huge one, to be able to understand trauma assessment for this youth. As long, and then combined with that risk assessment. So really wanting to look at all of that and then use that for post-adjudication and predisposition. So why is that piece important? And again, it kind of lists out the things you want to take under that: the general recidivism, mental health needs, cognitive, academic, psychological factors. Because what you're building is the plan. So now we know the youth has these needs. What will be their program placement? And then what we do that, what are we going to target? How do we start building a step-by-step roadmap to this is what the youth needs to do to get to program completion? And so that's why it's post-adjudication and predisposition is so important, because you should really have those conversations and know what those steps are when you start working through the program itself, even if it's individualized. And reassessment is incredibly important. So we know with adolescents, some of the recommendations are really those risk assessments, those kind of looking at where they're at and those treatment needs have about a 6-month shelf life. If not, you know, if there's a change, you want to redo it even maybe before then. But really, you don't want an assessment to just stand for a long period of time. Going back again to what we know with adolescent brain development, they're growing, they're changing. As they're going through treatment, they're growing and changing. As they get older, the risks they had at 15 may be different than 17. They're going to alter a bit. And so how do you still keep your eye on what goals, what steps you need to put in place to program completion through these reassessments? I don't know if there's anything coming through on assessments before we change to treatment plan.
No, I am not seeing any, so I think you're good to go.
And like I said, I've noted here the page you can read in the document, the actual kind of details of the recommended elements of those. So treatment planning, that really the initial should be done within 60 days and should not exceed 120 days. And that's just in recognition, again, you want to get the youth involved in their treatment right away, understanding what those goals are, understanding what that, how do I get to program completion? And so you don't want someone to be in a program and not know where you're working with them. Those treatment plans should be periodically reviewed and updated. Quarterly reviews tend to be the standard practice. So, you know, providers and that collaborative team can decide to do it sooner than that, if that makes sense for them. But really, by standard practice, you shouldn't let it go over a quarter. And make sure that those goals are evidence-based, that you have specific goals and evidence-based interventions to address those goals. Kind of standards of what we know. And that really then follows that risk, needs, and recidivism, those R&R principles. You know, youth, this is also where youth should really collaborate in the planning and identification of the goals. That make sure it's an evidence-based support, so it's supported to reduce recidivism and promote those pro-social functioning and development of the youth. And I think that's where we get back to in it, you know, it'll list out, here's the guidelines, talk about this, and it's just pages 13 and 14 kind of list the possible areas that youth should address that we know are hitting in research is this area. The reason that we say possible areas for the youth to address, though, is going back to that R&R, that it's really individualized. So you will have youth that won't need to meet all of those things. That goes back to that comprehensive assessment. Here's what we know in the field tends to be what you should focus on, but let's narrow that and make sure we're only focusing on the needs of that specific youth for those treatment. You know, again, going back to the youth should collaborate in planning and identification of goals. I'm sure this goes back to all the principles we know that we tend to use with all the populations, but is important with this population are those, you know, those motivational interviewing skills, making sure we're working with them on what where do they want to start. That's how you get that youth engagement. We've come a long way with this. I'll say, I remember before we really had a stress and focus on juveniles are different. A lot of those traditional models, there was, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. There was it was very rigid, and it was tougher. I guess I will say the same. You know, it used to be more of this is a population you're kind of really tough on, right? You don't allow any flexibility. They need to take ownership. They need to take responsibility. It's all on them to kind of keep this going. And versus taking a step back and again, knowing what we need to work on with youth, that really we need them to engage in the treatment. And so telling them what to do next isn't as impactful as working with them to hear kind of the next steps they want to take in that treatment plan. It does go over treatment modalities. And I think this is an important part of the conversation too, and what you'll see in here. You know, traditionally, group was it. Group, it's all group. In truth, individual can work just as well, and sometimes for some youth better than a group process. So it goes again back to that individual assessment. That's and that really knowing that there's no one right model. And so from a provider perspective, if individual is what is available and or that what seems to make sense for that youth, that's okay. There are some youth who could benefit from a group and do well in a group, and maybe they do better in a group than they would individually. And so wanted to highlight that it doesn't have to necessarily be group. But we did want to put guidance for if groups are given. So it should be a lower count and kind of setting up that group dynamic. Family therapy should be determined on a case-by-case basis. You know, we know with adolescents, with juveniles, those family treatment models are very, very effective. But I think this goes also back to the question that was asked earlier. We also know with this population, a lot of the times their victims are family members, siblings, cousins, individuals in the home. So it's important to really determine from that family therapy perspective what makes sense given the circumstances of that case. And then even if there is therapy, it's a, you know, the family is an active part of that youth's life. There's even assessments on how in depth do you go with different families. So that's really why it's really got to be that case by case, and goes back to that collaborative team of having those discussions. Obviously, we know sensitivity to cultural diversity is incredibly important. Procedures for modifications and modalities when working with individuals who have unique or special needs. You know, I think, and let's talk for just a moment about the SYTF population. I'll say this was a challenge that we had at DJJ2. For adolescents in general, for this group in general, we know individual is incredibly important, those individual treatment needs and an individualized treatment plan. You know, for us, we also had a number of youth that needed to get through a program in a number of different, you know, facilities. And so you need to have some standardization, at least we did, and maybe even as you're working through what makes sense for the SYTF, so that it's not completely subjective of what completion is. But even in the program models, where there's curriculum, you need to have flexibility within that curriculum to individualize it when it makes sense, and to make sure, again, you can really target those needs. So important conversations to have. And then victim reunification consideration should be guided by the best interest of the victim. That's not to say that those aren't important features, but it really, again, should be guided by the best interest of the victim. So if you have your client, this youth, who did have a sibling as a victim, for just an example, and really wants to be able to express the remorse and have a conversation with their sibling, it should really be around when their sibling is ready, not the youth that you're working with. All right. Specialized then there's a section that really talks about special populations and treatment considerations. So females, there's an acknowledgement there. This is a tricky group for juveniles and adolescents. So we know about 5 to 8% of the youth who sexually offend are females. They are likely to be younger and less likely to commit things like active rape. We have to remember gender responsiveness when we're, you know, the important conversations around gender responsiveness for any other youth who's in the juvenile justice arena is just as important for this. The pathways are different for girls. We know that. We know that females who tend to ascend sexually, the trauma tends to be even more than it is for girls in general, which is a lot. That says a lot, right? We know there's a lot of trauma, both for our boys and our girls, but this is a hard group in terms of, if you were to tell me what are the standards for female juveniles to treat for sex offenses, the research is not, there's not a lot of research out there because it's such a small population to research. So similarly, what we tend to look at for juveniles are the juveniles, males who are offending and having sexual offenses. We look to adolescent research and what works for them just as much as anything else. For our girls, we also look to what works for the girls and our females, and making sure that what is in play should be, again, trauma work, those healthy relationships, understanding healthy relationships, definitely dealing with any mental health needs. And within the context of that frame, addressing the sexual offenses. Mental health issues, really, there's a high prevalence of kind of co-occurring for psychiatric and learning deficits. So we don't want to negate dealing with those issues in lieu of focusing on the offense. So it's again recognizing that that's an important population to, that those needs are important to take into consideration, as well as looking at how does that impact the treatment itself. So we used as we were developing this, the ATSA guidelines of 2017 and the CCOSO recommendations around adolescence. We really looked at those two and pulled those all in. We want to acknowledge intellectual disability and making sure this goes back to some of the assessment piece, but making sure that treatment may need to be modified depending upon if you're running a program that has a specific curriculum specifically. It may not, it really is that curriculum going to be the best if there's an intellectual disability that might make them more difficult. So for example, cognitive behavioral may not work as well as behavioral. So making sure to look at that pieces. We wanted to include a specific area around emerging adults, 18 to 25, because this is the population that we had at DJJ. We tended to have the older population. And now at your facilities, you'll have this older population as well. The reason we wanted to acknowledge emerging adults is one, this is another area that there's still research is catching up. Research acknowledges that we know that for this 18 to 25-year-old population, they're kind of in this in-between space. A lot of their risks are more similar to juveniles than they are adults, but they're just still different. But a lot of the characteristics fit more with the juvenile treatment than it does the adult treatment. And one important consideration to make as well is there's not that magic flip that when you turn 18, you flip a switch and then all of a sudden you're a full-grown adult, you're thinking like an adult, you're acting like an adult, it's all done. We don't have that. And so we also have to recognize that even though we have youth that are biologically now an adult, their offense occurred when they were a minor, when they were under the age of 18. And so you can't assume that just because they've turned 18 and they're a magic adult, now that means they meet all of the risk factors and should be treated under that containment model because they've now reached that magical adult number. If their offense occurred when they were under the age of 18, there's been no, other sexual offending behavior after the age of 18. The risk factors, what the motivations that got them there fit with the age when the time of the offense occurred. So I know we've had some questions around that for the youth returning from DJJ. If they're over the age of 18, maybe they just can they fit into those adult programs? And it's a different population. It makes more sense to keep them under the juvenile aspects of treatment. And so we really wanted to highlight that in these guidelines. There's a section that speaks to family therapy and planning and just things to consider on that end. And then reconciliation too. Again, recognizing that a lot of, a lot of this population, their victims are also family members, maybe in the home. How do you start to think through reconciliation? And it's a challenging thing to look at. You obviously don't want to put anyone in a situation that is at more risk. You don't want to recreate victimization. I know for us on our end, it was challenging in many respects. Often we had families that really wanted to unify and come back together. And so how do you do that in a safe way? How do you have those conversations knowing that, particularly, I think, I always thought about it in terms of, I knew if it was a complete prevention, at some point, they're all going to come back together, because once they're out of supervision, if there's a desire there, it's going to happen. So then really looking at what makes sense for that family and how can we help them make sure it's a safe situation for everyone. But again, it's not something you want to just blindly jump into. So there's things to consider. We wanted to talk about treatment content and completion. So this goes back to, I've said it before, kind of what is the roadmap? How do you get to treatment completion? And I think this is important for all of the population, but I know as we're thinking through 6-month reviews in court, for those that are in the SYTF2, really understanding what is going to be treatment completion is an important part of the conversation, and would need to be an important conversation for I think these 6-month reviews too. So then what this section really looks at is acknowledging, again, you really want to identify those goals. What is the plan to treat for sexual recidivism? So what is this youth's risk for sexual recidivism, that dynamic piece that we can target with treatment, and have they then decrease that dynamic risk? And this is also where you can look at, for both this and the general, have they increased strengths around these areas as well? We all know you can't change the static factors, but those dynamic ones, you want to see them being addressed successfully as a part of assessing, are you completing treatment? Are you getting through treatment? But that general recidivism is going to be important to consider too. What is that? Those general recidivism dynamic risks that are being addressed, and are those risks decreasing? Are those strengths increasing? We know that when you've got youth who have lowered their risk and increased their strength, their chance of success is much higher. So it walks through things to think about for all of those pieces, and those we're on pages, and I should have noted it in the slide, but 19 and 20 is really what it gets into the details of those. Then really the other components, the final parts of this, again, the strengths, highlighted that a lot, but I think it's an important piece of it. And I'm sorry, I saw you go off mute, Rosie. So is there questions you want me to?
Well, there was, but if you wanted to, if these are tied to the other one, then we can pause after the slide if you like.
Okay, sure. So again, really highlighting the strengths are important. We wanted to note healthy sexuality. This is an important conversation, and again, kind of a change that has been made from those traditional models. I think, traditionally you didn't want to tend to talk about healthy sexuality. It was more of how do you avoid risky sexual situations. When we know with adolescents, this is an important part of growing up. Let's just talk about normal adolescence. Developing your sense of sexuality, exploring things through dating, that's absolutely normal adolescent behaviors that we tend to see. And so avoiding those conversations with this group actually increases their risk if they don't know what healthy sexuality is, if they don't know how to create healthy relationships, how to have, identify healthy partners. That is one of those things that could increase their risk. So a component of a healthy sexuality is a really important piece to have with any of these, whether it's discussed on an individual basis or on a group basis, but definitely important to include. We had a section where we talked about just how do you step down? And I think this is, again, an important piece we wanted to add, recognizing that with the realignment, those step down questions are going to be a big part of what's discussed at those 6-month reviews. So not surprising, you'll probably not be surprised me say this all goes back to the assessment, but have they completed those goals? Where are they at with those risks? And is it time for them? And this is where it goes back to that collaborative team, time for them to step down and they're ready to take that next risk. It is risk to step someone down, but you know, it's always, I think it's an important piece to have, to go from lots of resources to now you're on your own, to lots of resources, we've given you some skills, let's step you down, let's see how you're doing with that. We're still there to support you while you're working those things through, to help, you know, celebrate successes and help work through, oh, that didn't work out so well, before you're stepped down completely. So we did want to make sure there was a section there included regarding that. And then the final section in the guide is just stating, you know, not anything exciting, but other documentation that you may want to consider for your treatment programs. And then it goes into appendices. So in truth, that's really what the guidelines are. That's the sections that they have. And I will pause there and answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And before we get to Jeff's question, Lisa Campbell-Moten has been waiting very patiently. I'll go to hers in the chat first, and then Jeff, we can go to your question. She was speaking to reintegration therapy is something that STRTPs, formerly the group homes, the providers struggle with, and she wanted to know if you have a training resource for this particular intervention.
I don't, but you know what? I will ask to see if maybe anybody else on who was on the juvenile committee on CASOMB has any good recommendations for that. It is a challenging one for sure. Let me put that on my list, and then if we get some, I will send them so you can send them out.
Okay, great. Thanks, Heather. And then Jeff, I know you have also been waiting patiently.
First off, Heather, Rosie, thank you very much. I actually have a couple questions. I can start off by going to the one that initially caused me to raise the hand. Regarding this question of healthy sexuality, something that we've kind of recently encountered, but it's also been a continuous issue, is electronic search conditions. At least as the officers, we feel that that's something that almost should be standard for the juvenile sex offender population. However, we struggle with our courts because our courts are very much unwilling to authorize that. And I know that there are greater, issues with that. However, it is a constant problem. And again, approaching it from the healthy sexuality, or ensuring that the youth is kind of having a healthy sexual appetite, as opposed to going down that path of or just monitoring their sexual appetite, is important for us.
Yeah, that's a good question, and man, is it a hard one. I think this is something that the field's been talking about a lot too. The technology has changed everything. It's changed everything in terms of access to, what do you even call normal sexuality at this point? There used to be conversations around, really, you're trying to, with this population, look at, are they stepping outside of what a typical adolescent would do that you'd be concerned? Oh my gosh, how do you narrow that down, right? What is the typical adolescent doing? TikTok, Instagram. The scary thing with TikTok and Instagram for any adolescents is it's a really easy connection to click on something else that leads to porn. And one of the things that's also changed recently is what previously you'd have to search and send to another country to try to get porn that is that has kids, that is violent, that has all of those things. It's all accessible and easily. And what we're finding with all adolescents, and I'm starting with all adolescents, is because it kind of gets to that healthy sexuality piece. All adolescents are viewing more of those things than ever before, and not because they're attracted to kids, not because they're attracted to violence, but because it's there. And so, so I guess to step to your specific question, I would go, I think that's where that assessment piece and talking to the whole team is incredibly important, because what might be a risk in someone's search history for one youth may not be for another youth. Maybe for this youth, it is going to be a concern, and it's something that you need to take a look at. With this youth, it may be part of that normal adolescence piece of it. And if they are connected still to a treatment provider when you're supervising them too, I think the other piece with healthy sexuality is having conversations around that, just like we would want to have with adolescents. Like that access is there, but is it good? Is it healthy? Is that what you want to focus on? Or do you understand that what you're watching isn't real? That is not your normal relationship. So I think all of that plays a role. And maybe to your question of the courts piece is working together as a treatment team that I mean, this should be discussed as a whole and I guess and monitored to some extent, but how concerning the behavior is really going to be individual. I hope that answered your question a bit.
No, yeah, I think it did answer my question, and it is in there that it said that should be a part of the treatment plan. And I think the way that at least I will recommend it, we approach the issue is with these guidelines is that there's almost like a follow-up court case or court hearing once the treatment document or treatment plan is completed, to inform the court of any sort of adjustment and conditions that might need to be made based on the treatment provider's review. It's just something though that with this population, like I said, the officer's perspective, given the prevalence of pornography and access to pornography, it's almost like it should be a default condition rather than a fight for it.
Yeah.
And Jeff, did you have other questions? I thought you said you had a couple.
I do have a couple other, but I certainly would like to give others the opportunity if it's there.
Okay, well, we did receive one, so we can go to that one and then we can go back to you. So Kelly asked a question, is CASOMB going to be offering certification training for those that are seeking, practitioners? And
so at this point, no. If CASOMB does get the authority to walk down the road of doing certification, then that would also be part of the conversation, similar to the adult, how it works on the adult end.
Okay. And then Kelly, I know you also have a question and a comment in here about the workforce shortages, and there's obviously very specific work requirements and only a certain amount of people that desire to or that want to work with this population. And so certainly I think that is all part of the ongoing conversations that are really happening across the board, just with staffing and so forth. But I think something certainly too that is definitely on our radar and continues to be parts of conversations. And it sounds like we'll be having further conversations as CASOMB puts forward its recommendations and other, I know it has a legislative report as well that Heather had mentioned. So, but definitely agree with your points that you raised. Those are all the questions, Jeff. So if you want to go to one of your other ones, feel free.
This one question came up recently in one of our treatment team meetings. Understanding that telehealth was a kind of an adequate response to COVID. However, now that that's over with, the officer's perspective is that telehealth should almost be either like a as needed approach or kind of like a case by case type situation. What is CASOMB's position as far as telehealth being like a primary form or perhaps a sole form of treatment delivery?
So CASOMB hasn't kind of weighed in one way or the other. And part of the things that will happen, so on the adult end, let me just say on the adult end, they have, in recognition that some counties have more resources than others, it was acknowledged that telehealth is an option. If you're a county that doesn't have a provider who's certified, then telehealth would be a good option to be able to connect those services, and there's a list of resources. I think that would be probably a similar process that would be discussed and get lists of providers and walk through that in terms of that if the juvenile certification were to move forward. But they haven't, taken a necessarily stance on good, bad, don't do, or in these circumstances.
And I have one more question, but I saw something pop up in the chat, so.
Okay, well then hold that thought, because I think we will get time to go back to your other question. Another question that just came up, Heather, is are there resources for providers where they can get together and collaborate, discuss what they're doing in their programs, or participate in any ongoing trainings for juveniles specifically that you're that you might be aware of, Heather?
Yeah, so CCOSO, what is it? The California, and I'm going to mess up on my letters, but I'll give it. It's basically the California version of it. Oh my God, I should know this off the top of my head. I'll get up all the letters, but they meet yearly. They're a group that goes over, they're specific to addressing treatment of individuals who have committed sex offenses. So they're a good resource. ATSA is a good resource nationally. They have again, yearly meetings. They also have documentations that can be provided, but CCOSO, I think, would be the best connection in California to be able to get with other providers and to talk about, keep up to date on the research, get ideas, see what other folks are doing.
And that's, I'm going to think if I found the right thing, I'll drop it in the chat, but it's the California Coalition on Sexual Offending.
Yes.
Okay, I found their website, so I will
blame it on a Friday afternoon that I couldn't pull that off the top of my head. I'm so embarrassed.
Well, I'll just go with you. I didn't know of the group, so there I'll go in your so and then yes, so I think that Jeff, did you want to go to your question?
My last one, thinking of specialized caseloads and that recommendation, especially with possibly, a lot of the stuff we do as far as the treatment team collaboration and even, basically CFTs and stuff like that. But this greater emphasis on collaboration, is there any recommendations of like maximum caseload sizes for supervision or supervising officers?
CASOMB didn't look into that specifically because we know too, it's so varied with different counties on what that looks like or what it doesn't look like. So not specific to that, no.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a few minutes. So I have one question. Heather, going back to just working with the different populations, and you had mentioned, and the document speaks to female youth who are offenders and group therapy, and then not commingling treatment between or the groups with male and female youth. And so I was just curious because there's not likely, I would anticipate, as many female offenders as male, but I don't know that, but I think you may have said that. Does it matter if it's individualized, if they're not able to participate in a group because you only have maybe one youth who needs for the sex behavior treatment program part? Obviously, I think they can be a part of the larger programming, which you mentioned there is just as important, but for the part that's specifically dealing with the sex behavior treatment program, if it's just a more of a one-on-one, is there a difference?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the guidelines do speak to that too, that individual can be, is effective as well. I think, like I said, I think for years we got used to the default being group. And then if you can't do group, then do individual, versus really stepping back to say, what's best for that youth. And individual can be absolutely effective. So, and I think to your point, in those circumstances, yeah, that you can deal with it individually and work with that youth. Absolutely.
Well, those were all the questions that we got. I know it was very informative, and you're a wealth of information, and I learned about a new coalition, which I was not aware of, so appreciate that too. But do want to thank you, Heather, for participating with us and sharing all of this information. We will definitely get out her PowerPoint later today so that everyone has that, and we'll go ahead and resend the guidelines as well to everyone. And then I know there's a couple things in the next week or so that if we are able to gather that information, that was a couple questions, we'll be able to send that out to everyone as well. But I should say, Dr. Bolds, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and really appreciate your partnership. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this more into the future.
Thank you very much, and happy to be here. So take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.